evening, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to a very special edition of Illuminate. This evening, it is a joy and a pleasure to be able to be transmitting, albeit on a very wet Sunday afternoon from London, to our audience, our global audience, to our friends, our families, our networks in mainland Europe, across to the Caribbean islands, the Americas, and even to the CIS countries. We're so glad that you could join us on this platform, this digital platform, once again on Illuminate. This evening, as mentioned, is a very special evening because we are focusing this webinar on health, the importance of good health. And we're focusing around COVID-19 vaccines. This is important for us, and all of our efforts and our energies and our conversations over the past weeks and months, working with our partners in central, regional government and churches and other parachurch organizations, is to produce this collaborative effort to ensure that we can reliably inform our audiences everywhere of the importance of this vaccine. So this effort is being made on the part of many churches and parachurch organizations like West Midlands Faith in Action, Rafa International Development Agency, and Sentient Support Network Services. We have been having conversations for many months among the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities. And tonight is a very special gathering to address this topic, the topic of the hour, the Corona COVID-19 vaccines, which have been approved in this country. There's two, a third one very shortly will be available. And so this will be the first of two national summits. And I'm happy this evening to co-host with me Shamara Fletcher. Shamara currently serves as director of the William Seymour Trust Project at the Center of Theology and Community, which focuses on public, practical Pentecostalism. That is important. It might sound as a bit of a mouthful, but it's quite important. And so Tamara will be transitioning to what I consider to be a key ecumenical role within the United Kingdom in March. She will be serving as the principal officer for Pentecostal, charismatic, and multicultural relations. I am convinced that Shamara will build on the work that has been accomplished and will further enhance the work of CTE. So I invite you, wherever you are, give Shamara a hand clap of welcome and appreciation. Shamara, over to you.
Thank you so much, Bishop Tedroy. As has been said, I'm Shamara Fletcher, and I'm the director of the William Seymour Project for the Center of Theology and Community. It's an absolute pleasure to be co-hosting this very important event this evening. Now, the purpose for this evening is to have a public dialogue with our international virtual audience about the COVID-19 vaccine. It's going to be an informed space where we'll have the opportunity to really debunk some of the myths, but legitimize some of your concerns by speaking to an expert panel from a theological, socio-political, and scientific perspective. In this last week, we have seen a national apology from our Prime Minister as we have reached 100,000 deaths due to COVID-19. And just to give you a bit more context of what's happening in our national context, 3.2 million of the most vulnerable people, those who are in care homes, have already received their first dose. The NHS has also opened their first 7 vaccination centres for people over 80, along with health and care staff. Almost 1,200 vaccination sites have already been set up across the United Kingdom, and hundreds more will be opening very soon. You may have heard this already, but we really want to reiterate this because it's very important for the current climate that we are in. The government has set a target to offer the vaccine to everyone in a top 4 priority area. Number 1, and this is by the 15th of February, the first is residents in a care home for older adults and their carers. The second are for those who are over 80 and are on the front line delivering our precious services during this time. The third one is for those who are 75 and over. And then the fourth and final one is those who are 70 years and over and clinically are extremely vulnerable. So that's just to give you a bit of context to the current climate we are in. But tonight, we will hear from a range of our international panelists and experts from across civic society to help us with this discussion this evening. So I will now hand over to our co-host, our National Presiding Bishop, Bishop Tedroy Powell. Over to you, Bishop.
Thank you, Shamara. And I am really very, very thankful for those that have collaborated with myself, other national church leaders over the many weeks and months that we have been walking, working, reflecting, and planning together to ensure that we can serve our communities in an effective way. Shamara, I'm sure that you're excited about this, considering the work that you have been doing at the William Seymour Project for the time that you have been. I'm sure that you have been engaged in a number of meetings. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes, Bishop. I've been engaging in a number of meetings, and it's absolutely phenomenal to hear what different people are saying, but also giving the platform to hear what people are saying. Oftentimes, we can speak on behalf of communities, but it's very important that we give the platform for communities to speak to us to inform our next stages. So, yes, we have.
Indeed, and the community have spoken, and they are still speaking. As you would know, over the past weeks, we have been informing them, publicizing of Illuminate, this very special edition, and the questions have come in tens. We've got maybe approaching at least 100 questions in total. So our experts, our panelists, I'm sure that they're revving up and raring to go. And so let us just go a little bit further then. And so I'm happy this evening to introduce our panelists to you. When the approaches were made, these individuals, though they are very, very busy, they are in big demand, they readily made themselves available so that they could serve you. And so then, allow me to give a very brief introduction to our panelists. Now, Mayor Andy Street, who you'll be hearing from, is the chair of the West Midlands Combined Authority. He has a key role, has significant powers and influence over some of the biggest issues affecting people's lives in the West Midlands. Mayor Street represents around 2.8 million people across local council areas within the West Midlands. As you know, next to London, the West Midlands is probably the largest conurbation within the United Kingdom. Within that, we have towns like Birmingham, Coventry, Dudley, Solihull, Sandwell, Walsall, and Wolverhampton. Councillor Street has been the leader of an executive director for the Department of Communities and Local Government, as well as a member of the Prime Minister's Business Advisory Group. That is Councillor Andy Street. In addition, we also have Professor Garrick. Dr. Garrick oversees convergence science training at Imperial College London and the Institute of Cancer Research. Convergent science is the amalgamation of biological, chemical, engineering, natural, and physical sciences to develop new methodologies and technologies for the prevention, detection, and treatment of cancers. He received core training in infectious diseases, including molecular virology and viral pathogenesis, from the University of Birmingham, a city that I know well. I grew up in Birmingham, and Public Health England. He is a noted publisher of several scholarly articles describing various aspects of human diseases, including viral infection and transmission. He's also a minister at Charisma Christian Centre, Bishop Grandison, in London, with a portfolio in education and training, and runs a mentoring initiative which promotes the educational and entrepreneurial aspirations of young Black men. We welcome you, sir, to this telecast this evening. And over to you, Shamara.
Thank you. And we've just received some notification from our media team that on just one of our platforms alone, we've got over 500 people tuned in. So we can see the prominence of this topic. Thank you so much, Bishop. Next, we're really looking forward to welcoming Professor Webley, who is the director of a pre-med and pre-health advisory group at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He serves as a faculty senator. He's a member of the Rules Committee and the University Health Council, and he serves on the editorial boards of the International Journal of Vaccines and Immunization. His research focuses on infectious diseases and the role of specific infections in chronic diseases. We are so privileged to have Professor Webb with us today, who has been recognized in national media coverage for organizing and moderating a panel at the 2014 Ebola outbreak that originated in Liberia and Sierra Leone and spread to other several countries, including the United States. Thank you so much, Professor Webley, for being with us. It's a privilege to have you on our panel this evening. We are also privileged to have Dr. Amanda Brown Bennett, who is a counseling psychologist and clinical supervisor with a passion for supporting those whom we would consider being at the front line of helping professionals. She describes herself as one who helps the helper. We really do need that, particularly in this climate, including caregivers, clinicians, and religious leaders. Dr. Amanda has conducted research at a psychological impact of religious leadership and has co-hosted a faith-based talk show addressing matters concerning psychological well-being. We will definitely have to have you back in that capacity, Dr. Amanda. She also draws from her personal journey along with her expertise to deliver workshops and consultancy to church groups and organizations in supporting psychological well-being. Welcome, Dr. Amanda. It's a privilege to have you. I'm now going to hand back over to our co-host for this evening, Bishop Tedroy Powell.
Thank you. Wow, I am really excited about this. And last but not least, maybe our guests would agree with me, the best wine is always served last. Of course, I'm no connoisseur, that's what I hear. And so it is a pleasure to introduce to you this evening our final expert, Dr. William Acker. Dr. William is a theologian and senior lecturer in the Department of Geography at Birkbeck University of London. He is the current chair of the Transatlantic Roundtable on Religion and Race, an international organization that brings together academics, community activists, and faith leaders with the aim of tackling injustices faced by people of African descent around the world. He is the chair of the Decolonizing Academy at College at Birkbeck University, London, and has over 20 years experience designing and teaching courses on race equality. Dr. Acker, we welcome you. There's a great applause going out to all our panelists in this digital space. God bless you. And so, as we focus our thoughts and we've introduced our panelists to you, we will be having our first presentation. But before we do that, we'd just like to treat you, as it were, for you to immerse with us in our first worship song, because essentially we believe we were created to worship God. Enjoy this song with me, please. Thank you.
I worship you, Lord. I worship you, Jesus. I worship you, Almighty God. There is none like you. I worship you, O Prince of Peace. That is what I long to do. I give you praise, for you are my righteousness. I worship you, Almighty God. There is none like you. I worship you, Almighty God. There is none like you. I worship you, O Prince of Peace. That is what I long to do. I give you praise, for you are my righteousness. I worship you, oh my mighty, 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 mighty God, Lord, for there is none like you. There is none like you. Yes. No one else can touch my heart like you do. Hallelujah. And I can search for all eternity long and find there is none like you. If you agree, sing with me that there is none like you. No one else can touch my heart like you do, Jesus, yeah. And I can search for all eternity long and find there is none, there is none, there is none, there is none, there is none like you. There is none, 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 there is none. like you, loving like you. There is none like you. Holy like you, worthy like you, loving like you, strong like you, holy like you, worthy like you, strong like you, oh Lord. There is none, no. There is none, no. There is none, oh. There is none like you. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Blessed be the name of the Lord, now and forevermore. We bless your name. We bless your name, both now and forevermore. We bless your name, Jesus, now and forevermore. Now and forevermore, yes, Jesus. Now and forevermore, bless your name. Now and forevermore, yes. Now and forevermore, we bless your name. We bless your name. We bless your name. Now and forevermore, yeah. Now and forevermore, we bless your name. There is none like you. Hallelujah. So we give you praise, yes, Lord, for you are our righteousness. Oh, we worship you, Almighty God. There is none like you.
Thank you so much, Dornisha, reminding us that there is no one like our Creator God. And so we would like to go forward now into our first presentation from our panelists. And this will be from Andy Street, Mayor, a Metropolitan Mayor for the West Midlands. Now, he will be addressing the vaccine from the perspective, a socio-political perspective. And so, Andy Street, thank you.
Hello, Andy Street, Mayor of the West Midlands, and I'm delighted to be joining the Church of God of Prophecy for your event tonight on holistic health. Now, we know that the last 10 months has been dominated by the pandemic, and we know that every community across the West Midlands has been incredibly affected by this. And of course, my heart goes out to those who individually have lost loved ones. But we also know that the impact on communities has been different, and some of the black and minority ethnic communities have been worse affected than indeed others, and indeed the white population. So it's only right that the Combined Authority called this out very honestly in our Health of the Region report that looked at the unequal impact of the pandemic. We've been honest, and we've actually called for about 50 different actions that will help address the inequalities underlying all of this. And that's all available if you want to look on our website. But tonight, your event is all about the short-term way out of the pandemic. And that, of course, is all about getting vaccinations into people's arms. And across the West Midlands as a whole, the vaccination programme is going really well. And thank you to the NHS, pharmacists, volunteers, everybody who's making that happen. But we do know if we're honest, that in some communities, and particularly in the African and Caribbean communities, there are those who are reluctant to have the vaccination. So tonight is about reassuring everybody that it is safe to have the vaccination. So for example, the vaccination does not contain any animal products at all. You'll hear from a panel of experts tonight that I hope will give you that reassurance. And I know that leaders like yourselves will play an incredible role in getting the message out to your community, because that's one of the things I've learned in the last 10 months, the critical importance of the faith networks in getting the messages out. So thank you for what you have done and what you will do in getting that message out. So hopefully you'll be reassured today, and indeed on Monday afternoon at 2 o'clock, I'm hosting in the Combined Authority a roundtable on vaccination safety, and anybody will be welcome to view that as well. It will be being broadcast online. So we've all got a collective responsibility of getting the message out. We need to achieve 80% vaccination level across the whole of society if we genuinely are to move to the end of the pandemic and back to something more akin to normal life. So thanks for putting tonight's event on, and I very much hope you enjoy it and learn from it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mayor Andy Street from Birmingham. Thank you for giving us your video this evening. We will now hear from Dr. Garrick Wilson, who will be speaking to us about the COVID-19 vaccine from a scientific perspective. Over to you, Dr. Garrick.
Thank you, Shamara. Thank you to Bishop Powell also, and it's good to be here. To my fellow guest panelists, it's great to be in your company also. Good evening, everyone. We have entered into what I suppose you could call a brave new world, and we must navigate this new world. And who would have thought at this time last year that we would have found ourselves engaged in a conversation such as the one that we're having now, a conversation where in less than a year in the UK context, over 100,000 people have sadly lost their lives due to COVID-19. But I believe tonight is a conversation that goes beyond vaccine and virus. There is much here to ponder with. It is in part a conversation of faith, whereby faith practitioners around this country must contend with this from a theological perspective. What's really going on here? What does God have to say about it? What do we have to say about it through the lenses of our faith? Another of our panelists will probably touch on that later. Do we consider this from a eschatological perspective or otherwise? There is much that we have to think about here. From a activism perspective, there's a conversation of justice that is taking place here. What is the right thing to do? We cannot hide or deny the history of medical trials that our people, I'm talking about Black people especially, are being subjected to. We've heard of the 1930s Tuskegee trials in the United States, subjecting Black men, African-American men, to syphilis infection. You'd have heard in 1996 in northern Nigeria, Pfizer, who is behind one of our vaccine candidates currently, has trialed a anti-meningitis drug which ended up killing several children and also severely disabling several children. These were atrocious medical experimentations. And when we speak of Black people, I must put this in a wider context of a global community. In other words, if it affects Black people in the United States or Africa, we here in the UK tend to feel that effects also, in that a Band-Aid offered to bring about compliance is not enough to bring soothing to the history that we had to contend with. I don't believe that this is just a conversation of scaremongering, nonsense, conspiracy theories. Yes, there are some of that out there, but I think some individuals are asking justified and in fact logical questions, and it is right to do so. I'm sure Professor Webley will agree that part of the scientific process is about scrutiny. It's about robustness, scrutinizing data, iterative testing and analysis. And I think it's great when we can see us as a people from Black and minority ethnic communities participating in these conversations, and also churches engaging in the wider context of the political sphere, the educational, and in fact, the healthcare sectors as well. The hesitancy that I hear in totality, as I said, it's not just based on conspiracy theories, but I put to you that there are some reasoned and good commentaries based on shared experiences. And of course, if there is a lack of clarity in terms of the information that has been presented to us, we will have these conversations. Let's not forget the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 has had on the Black community in this country. Many of us came through the Christmas period with one or perhaps more of our family members missing from the Christmas dinner table because they've been lost to the pandemic. We're still very much in a grieving process. It was therefore illogical, I would say, and of course, quite contentious for French doctors earlier on in last year to suggest that we should test vaccine candidates in the African populations. There is historical precedence here in that scientists, and I think this is something that needs to be challenged, sees Africa as a mass testing ground. This is in some quarters, not in all quarters. I must be clear there, because there is a large population. And in fact, performing clinical trials in these areas is much cheaper than doing them in the Western world. And that's something that needs to be challenged. Sometimes Africans who are not properly educated in terms of what is going on. In fact, when we go back to the meningitis trials of Pfizer in 1996 in Nigeria, a lot of the parents would say that they didn't know their children were enrolled in a clinical trial. And it is only after fatalities occurred and after disabilities came forth that they were conscious as to what is going on. So there is a bigger problem here to challenge in terms of our activism. There's also a wider problem that this is bringing us our consciousness to, and that is one of, certainly in my area, in the UK context, there are very few people from Black backgrounds participating in the scientific and medical professions. And as a result, when things like this occur in society, we have very few voices that can come out and confidently speak on the matter to encourage our communities. But I must also pay tribute to those who have been involved in the development of the current licensed vaccine candidates that we have in the UK. Individuals such as Kizzmekia Corbett from the United States, a scientist involved in the Moderna vaccine development. Individuals such as Mustafa Bitey from the UK, involved in the Oxford and AstraZeneca vaccine development. And oftentimes you won't hear many names of Black individuals called because they are effectively workhorses behind the scenes, lab technicians and research scientists who are making it happen in the background. And only the head of that group or the supervising director of the project will be seen or exposed to your attention. And oftentimes that face doesn't look like yours or mine. So we must be conscious as well that behind the scenes, there are individuals that look like us, not enough, that are involved in the vaccine development. I believe then that this calls for us to encourage people from African and Caribbean backgrounds to join the scientific and medical communities such that we can adequately inform our people should anything like this ever happen again. I'll also go on and say that there is a question of trust. And maybe we've not considered, but I put this to you that perhaps, just perhaps, that we don't trust those who are leading the vaccine narrative. We don't trust the politicians who cannot stand up and say, Black lives matter. And skepticism will naturally present itself when we do not have trust in our political leaders. Then they tell us that taking the vaccine rather, is the right thing to do. Perhaps there isn't a specific scripture that we can turn to for those of you who are Christians that will say to you, you should take the vaccine. And perhaps Dr. Acker will tell us otherwise later. But in the absence of a formula from the Bible, I will say to my Christian brothers and sisters, what do you think the heart of God is concerning this? Is it his will that we should all make a conclusive decision based on a lack of information? Is it his will that we should make a conclusive decision based on unproven, unconfirmed information that is being sent to us through maybe our WhatsApp group chats or on other social media platforms? Is it his will that we achieve herd immunity in other parts of the population, for example, in the Caucasian population, and yet this virus will still be left to run rampant within the African and Caribbean communities? Is it his will? And so what is the just thing here to do? I'm sure you will hear other presentations this evening about the vaccine developmental process, and I'm sure questions will come through also that I'll be quite happy to answer in terms of how these candidates were developed, and in fact, their safety record, their efficacy record, and what this means for us. But finally, I want to say that it's a conversation about education, that we need to make science clear for goodness sakes, and also need to discriminate or distinguish between what is science policy and actual scientific data. The way that science works in government, a scientist can advise the government, but in fact, the final outcome of that advice may be watered down somewhat because the government, in formulating policy, must take into account other areas such as what business leaders are saying. What is the NHS leaders saying? What are educational leaders and leaders from other sectors saying? And that in turn will come together to form a combined policy. So we need to also educate ourselves in terms of how policies are developed. And so what is science, fact, and political advice or political mandate are completely different things. And perhaps what we need then is to hear directly from those who've been educated, trained, and even involved in the development of these vaccine candidates to educate ourselves that we can delineate appropriately. I believe that after tonight's conversation, hesitancy can turn into confidence. And where there's hesitancy, I think we should make it clear as well that is different to being an anti-vaxxer. We are just hesitant because we do not know all the facts and all the information. Thank you. Back to the host.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Garrick. I really do appreciate your intervention, the information, how you structured that, presented it in a way that all of us can grasp that. The theme running through that, in summary for me, and most will see, is we need to be informed, to be educated, to make right decisions, not based on assumptions, etc., and we be more representative. You know, as you spoke, I thought of what Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. And so if I love myself, I will take care of myself. I will seek to be informed. And in seeking to be informed, I can serve my neighbor effectively. So there are some key strands for us to engage with as we go forward. So thank you so much. We're going to move forward now to our next presentation, which will be by Professor Wilmore Webley. Professor Webley, thank you.
Thank you so much, Bishop. Thank you, Sister Fletcher, for co-hosting. I want to say a big thank you to the Church of God of Prophecy organization for highlighting this really important issue at this specific time. And thank you, Dr. Wilson, for that passionate and really all-encompassing introduction to tonight's presentations. And essentially what I want to do is exactly what you've said, is exactly what you've highlighted. Education is so very important. And I think many times when scientists come to the populace, the assumption is made that you cannot understand the science. So let me not even bother to tell you about it. And so we are left in a lurch, not understanding what is going on. And as a result, as you clearly said, there is hesitancy, which sometimes turn into an advocacy against vaccine, but never really started that way. It's because of a lack of information. So I hope that what I'll do this evening is to break down some of that science and share with you a little bit about this virus and how these vaccines are developed. So I will share my screen now. with you as I make this presentation to you about what I know about this vaccine, these vaccines that you have been that have been put before you, and so that we can now have a good conversation about that. So pandemics are nothing new to the human population. We've been contending with pandemics for as long as we can remember. You go back to the Justinian plague in 541 thereabouts. Smallpox, huge amount of people affected. Measles, the Black Death or bubonic plague, and maybe a little bit closer home, something like the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919, that killed anywhere from 50 to 100 million people. It's not clear because at the time, because of the World War, it was just not clear what was happening. And don't forget HIV/AIDS that continues to ravage sub-Saharan Africa and other places in the world. And one could look at that and say, maybe if it was ravaging more areas with people who had lighter complexion than we are, maybe they would have some more attention to it. But suffice it to say, one of those organisms that we teach and that I teach to my immunology and infectious disease classes have been this family of coronaviruses. These are not new organisms. They were actually discovered in the 1960s at the University of Chicago. But as you can see, they caused the common cold, and as a result of that, nobody really talked about them. They were given these alphanumeric codes instead of real names. Until, of course, what happened in the year 2002, 2003, when the original SARS virus came upon us, very quickly became a pandemic, ended up killing about just under 800 people, which was about 10% of the people infected. And at that time, the efforts to make a vaccine against these organisms actually started. That's an important context for you. But in 2012, MERS came about because, you see, the original SARS-CoV-1, it kind of disappeared the moment it came up. It just infected all these people and just went off the radar. And if it's not around, you can't test a vaccine on it. And so then in 2012 came MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome virus, and it's relegated to the Middle East. It has continued in there. And one of the reasons for that is that it has found itself sitting in the Arabian Peninsula is that it actually gets transmitted from camels to humans. So there's no direct human-to-human transmission. And as a result of that, we haven't seen it around. But what is common among all of these SARS viruses is the fact that they come from a reservoir, typically of bats or other rodents, have some intermediate host, and then gets transmitted to humans. Right, that is their typical mode of transmission. For the current outbreak for SARS-CoV-2, we don't really know what the intermediate host is. Some people believe it's the pangolins. Others say it's something else. Others say it could have been directly transmitted from a bat to a human. But based on the genetic sequence, it has become clear that this virus came from bats as a reservoir. Not a surprise, because that is what we've seen over the years, and somehow made it into the human population. We now know very well how it is transmitted from one person to the next. It is believed that this virus outbreak started in Wuhan, China, a big city where people go in and out right around the time as the Chinese New Year was coming up. And one of the things that is very common in this city are these wet markets. Just to give you an idea of how this could have come about. And what happens in these wet markets is that you can go and purchase meats and other food items in the same place. And just to give you an idea of how some of these are set up, here you have a wild trussed chicken that's sitting on top of vegetables that are going to be sold as well. And you see here a cutting board that if you want vegetables or the chickens to be killed, that will happen. And here you have some frogs that are also being sold, and that would be killed at that same place. And you can see here a person who is actually dressing the frogs and other fish that they're selling. You can see the dirty basins and the scale here. In other words, this is prime real estate for transmission of what we call zoonotic infections, infections that typically originate in animals and come over into humans. Now, SARS-CoV-2, or the disease that it caused, COVID-19, is a disease of the respiratory tract mainly. And the reason I'm going a little bit into this is that we often think about this disease as being a disease that affects just two groups of people. One group that doesn't make it, and the other group that survives it and is fine. That couldn't be further from the truth. There's a third group of individuals who get infected, and for a long time, they lose their sense of smell and taste. And this is an image I'm showing you. All of these red dots that you're seeing here, these are actually the virus. And where is it? It's right in the olfactory mucosa, which is just at the base of the brain, which means that this can certainly affect the brain. And we know it does in some way, either directly or indirectly. Otherwise, you wouldn't lose your sense of smell and taste and then have foggy brain, as some other people describe it. One of the other things that we've seen a lot of recently is what we now call COVID tongue, where you see these kind of papular rashes, these indentations on the tongue. You see these areas here around the side of the tongue, and swollen tongue as a result of COVID-19. One of the other things we've seen a lot of people having headaches and fatigue and loss of taste and loss of smell and skin rashes and kidney diseases. In other words, when you look at the plethora of sequelae that one can get from this virus, it's not a matter of dying or surviving the virus. Lots of people who survive the virus will never be the same. So that's an important consideration to keep in mind. And then, of course, the more this virus gets transmitted, the more opportunity it has to make errors each time it replicates itself. And those become mutations that lead to new variants of the virus. You might be very much familiar with the B.1.1.7, not a fancy name, but it's a mutation that has happened. And here is the spike protein that the virus uses as a key to unlock our cells to get in. And this area with purple is exactly the area that that key meets the lock. And if you notice, all of these dots in black is where the virus is making mutations, and you can see it has made strategic mutations in that binding site that it uses to attach to our cells. And look at the date over here. This is in November, and you can see how quickly this strain spread over the entire UK, enveloping London in a very, very short time and just taking over. In essence, then, this is a much more transmissible virus, and essentially what it did is that it became more efficient in infecting. And so worldwide, we have over 102 million people infected with this virus, over 2 million people dead. Clearly, this is not your garden variety flu virus, and it seems to be very dangerous. You would have seen these cartoons showing the virus, and the reason I'm showing you this is that I want you to notice that these little things on the surface called the spike, and the coronavirus actually got its name as a family from that. You can see this is an electron microscopy image. This is coming straight from under a microscope. They false colored it purple, and you can see around it, it has this crown-like shape. That's how it's got its name. The disease, of course, is COVID-19, and the virus is severe acute respiratory syndrome virus, coronavirus 2. But the thing that I want you to show you here, here's an image of a cell that has become infected with the virus. This whole big thing is a cell. And all of those little yellow dots that you're seeing on it are viruses, coronaviruses. In other words, within hours, within 7 to 72 hours of infecting a cell, you can have tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of viruses coming from that cell ready to infect new cells. And this cell that you're seeing here, the reason it looks so funny like a tree root is because it's actually dying. It realizes now that it cannot overcome this infection, and it's actually dying by a process that we call pearl death. Now, the WHO, World Health Organization, says the 2 public health interventions that have had the greatest impact on the world's health are clean water and vaccines. And I totally agree with that as an infectious disease person. And immunization is a proven tool for controlling and eliminating life-threatening infections or infectious diseases, and is estimated to avert between 2 and 3 million deaths each year. And that is also a fact. Now, why is it that our immune system can't protect us just as is, and so that we actually need a vaccine? There's a very simple reason for that. You see, when you're introduced to a bacterium or a virus or any infectious agent for the first time, it takes approximately 2 weeks, 10 days to 2 weeks, for the immune system, for your adaptive immune response to reach its peak. It depends on what we call your innate or your built-in immune response to bring down the levels of the infection, to give it time so that this adaptive immune response, you hear people talk about antibodies and the level of antibodies. It takes around 10 days to 2 weeks for that antibody level to reach a respectable area where it can actually defend you. Now, look at what happens when you're exposed a second time. This lag of 2 weeks now turns into a day and a half to 2 days. That is what the vaccine does. It primes your immune system so that, it primes your immune system so that when you see that bug for real, you will be ready to fight. It doesn't matter how healthy you are. It has nothing to do with the health of your immune system. It's just that that is the way the system works. Now, microbes can divide every 20 minutes. You can have bacterial division. It takes a human cell about a full day to make a division, because that division has to be controlled. There's checkpoints in the division. And so it takes that amount of time for you to actually develop enough cells to make enough antibodies and to have memory cells so that when you get exposed the second time, and this is why the booster shots work, that second shot of the vaccines, when you get exposed the second time, not only do you have a faster response, but you have a much bigger response. And to show you that vaccines work, these 2 boys, age 13, got exposed to smallpox on the same day from the same source. The only difference, the one on your right was vaccinated, the one on your left was not. Vaccines can work and they can be made safely. So what we're trying to reach with any level of vaccination is what is called herd immunity. And this is the idea that if you have very few people in your community who are vaccinated, and you get even one person who is infected, that's the person in orange there, in a very short time, you can infect all of the vulnerable population because you just don't have enough people to be kind of a guard against it. However, if you have up to 85% of your population vaccinated, those are the people in blue, and you have one infected person, that person doesn't have the opportunity to infect a whole population of those who are vulnerable, because the people who are vaccinated becomes a guard. There's nobody to transmit from one to the other because you're all protected. In other words, we become our brother's keepers, right? That is the biblical narrative. And so what you want then is that you want your body to be primed to make these Y-shaped proteins called antibodies so that they can bind to that coronavirus protein that we call the spike protein, so that it will prevent it from binding to this lock on our cells that we call the ACE2 receptor and neutralize it. Several vaccines are in development in order to do this. You have some approved there in the UK. We have 2 here in the US. There's several more in the pipeline coming up. And you can see here the Moderna and the Pfizer, as well as the AstraZeneca vaccines, are the ones that you have now. A little bit different platform, where the AstraZeneca vaccine is actually what we call a viral vector vaccine. In other words, what they have done is taken a virus, adenovirus. They have taken the genes that make the spike protein, put it into that virus. That virus cannot cause disease in us. It cannot replicate in us. But what it can do is that when it gets in, it can actually express that spike protein. And when our bodies see it, that priming that I talked about, that happens. And now antibodies are made against that protein as it is released, and we get vaccinated against it. So that's the basic understanding, and I can answer more questions on it. And the truth is that the United Kingdom is doing a really good job vaccinating. The NHS and other agencies have to be commended for vaccinating some. Only Israel and the UAE is doing better at this stage in vaccination compared to the UK. Now, I want to explain to you in a very short period of time how mRNA vaccines are made. Here you have a cartoon of a cell. The purple that you're seeing here is the nucleus. This is where the DNA lives. The cell thinks that the DNA is so important that it would not allow it out of the nucleus. However, the DNA has all the information to make all the proteins. The proteins are the workhorses of the body. So what it does is that it creates a message that it sends outside into this factory called the ribosome to actually make those proteins. In other words, it's like being in a position where you're trying to make a cake. The recipe for that cake is in the library in a book that's very rare, only one copy of it. And now you have to go to the library, photocopy the pages that you need, take them out of the library, and take it to the kitchen to make your cake. The library on reserve would be your nucleus. The message would be the transcript that you take out there. And so the dogma is that you go from DNA to RNA to protein, which means that essentially you're going through transcription and translation. You're making a transcript or a copy, then you're translating that message into a protein. I'm just going to play a little animation here that explains that to you.
When the RNA copy is complete, it sneaks out into the outer part of the cell. Then all the components of a molecular factory called a ribosome lock together around the RNA. It translates the genetic information in the RNA into a string of amino acids that will become a protein. Special transfer molecules, the green triangles, bring each amino acid to the ribosome. Inside the ribosome, the RNA is pulled through like a tape. There are different transfer molecules for each of the 20 amino acids shown as small red tips. The code for each amino acid is read off the RNA 3 letters at a time and matched to 3 corresponding letters on the transfer molecules. The amino acid is added to the growing protein chain, and after a few seconds, the protein starts to emerge from the ribosome. Ribosomes can make many proteins. It just depends what genetic message you feed into the RNA.
In other words, the ribosome here is like a protein factory in your body. And it basically can make any protein that it gets the code for. And so what they have done with the Pfizer-BioNTech and the Moderna vaccine is that they have built on that technology where they got the sequence for the spike protein that I told you was the key that the virus uses to unlock the door of our cells and get in. Once they got that sequence, they literally went to what is called a DNA printer, where they took the sequence of the RNA from the virus, printed it out into DNA, and made a copy of that, the mRNA, the message, just like that transcript that you took from the library. They encapsulated it into lipids, because if you just put it in by itself, it gets destroyed by the body. And so it's encapsulated into lipids, that's fat, and then put into the body, where it gets taken up by cells, muscle cells, immune cells, whatever sees it first. They take it up and make multiple copies of not the virus, just the spike protein, which now generates an immune response, these Y-shaped proteins called antibodies. And that is actually what protects you. That's how this vaccine works. So here's another animation showing
mRNA technology has never been used before in an approved vaccine, but scientists are using it now to combat COVID-19. mRNA, or messenger ribonucleic acid, are snippets of genetic code that tell cells to build proteins. mRNA vaccines take advantage of that protein-building process to trigger an immune response and build immunity to SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. Instead of using a small dose of live or dead virus like some other vaccines, mRNA vaccines use a tiny piece of the virus's own genetic material. Here's how it works. This is the virus. These are called spike proteins. Scientists have isolated the genetic code for those proteins, a set of instructions that are put into the vaccine so your body knows how to make them. Your immune system won't make an actual virus particle, but it will make copies of the angry red spike protein. In other words, no gray ball, but an angry red spike. Once vaccinated, your body starts making those spike proteins, so your immune system will develop antibodies to fight the real
thing. So that, in essence, is the technology. Now, finally, this technology is not new. I want to show you that in 1992, they had already thought about this system where they were actually using it in a rat model to actually make proteins to prevent or reverse diabetes. Here's a 2017 publication where you can see they're looking at mRNA for rabies vaccine and actually going through their first phase of human trials for it. Here's a 2019 paper looking at it to make a flu vaccine. Here is a media push looking to make a Zika vaccine from Moderna. Here is another publication in January of 2020, before the sequence was made fully available, where they're looking to make a cytomegalovirus vaccine. In other words, this is something that they've known about. mRNA vaccines is a new era. And so hopefully that gives you a background that actually says this is not something that they just came up with when SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 came around. This is a technology that has been in place for quite a while, and they were just perfecting it, and now got to the place where they were able to make it plain. And I will stop there, and at the end, I will be able to take questions and hopefully answer your questions on that. I'll now turn over to the hosts.
Thank you so much, Professor Webley, for that excellent explanation and clarification. Thank you for sharing a historical trajectory of pandemics throughout history, from the Spanish flu to the plague, and from SARS as well, and for challenging some of the myths and with credible information about the origins and the transmission of the vaccine, and for showing us some of the symptoms as well. And we do ask for our international audience who are watching us tonight, to listen, to learn, to see a different perspective from one you may hold. And there will be opportunity at the end through our plenary to ask your questions from our expert panel. So thank you again, Professor Webley, for that excellent explanation. We're now going to go over to Dr. Amanda Bennett-Brown, who will be speaking to us about the effects of COVID-19 on our mental health. Over to you, Dr. Amanda.
Thank you, Sister Fletcher. Thank you, Bishop, and the other panelists as well. It's really been good so far to hear what has been said so far. I know that, it's really helped me to understand a bit more as well what we are dealing with. And it's so great to hear as well representatives from the Black community that have the expertise and have looked into the research. So thank you very much. I want to talk about the impacts of us on our psychological health in terms of the pandemic and also of the vaccine. And so the first thing I want to start off by acknowledging is that this pandemic has certainly contributed to an increase in psychological distress. And that is not just from a population which beforehand may have reported struggling with psychological health, but also what we're seeing is an increase in distress from people that before the pandemic may have identified as having quite a positive and quite healthy psychological well-being. And when I'm talking about psychological well-being, what I'm referring to is our mental and emotional health. So what we know is things such as, job loss, furlough, lockdown, school closures, what's happened with all these cancelled exams, with the deaths, all these things that have taken place. What we know is that these have had impacts on socialization, our financial statuses, relationships as well. And some, and I say some of the psychological impacts, because there are so many, have been things such as isolation, a loss of control, grief, anxiety, confusion, and certainly an increase in mistrust. I really could go on, but what the pandemic has done is it's raised many questions. Some questions such as, how long will this last? When will things go back to normal? And actually, what will the new normal be? How do we overcome this? And will we ever be able to get things under control? We've also know that some ask, is COVID-19 a cover up for something else that is going on? It's definitely got us all talking. And something I feel as well is that it's also got us unified in some things, because we are all searching for answers. We all feel quite vulnerable at the moment, and we are all in this together. And then something interesting happened. The vaccine came about. And something that I personally feel has happened is what we've seen is some have become quite hopeful and see this as an answer, or perhaps even the answer, and have already or are willing to take the vaccine. We know that some are quite skeptical and mistrusting and perhaps quite adamant that they won't take the vaccine. And then for others, we know that what it's done is this led to an increased helplessness and more confusion around, knowing whether to take the vaccine or whether they shouldn't take the vaccine. And where we all perhaps have been fighting this disease together, our feelings about the vaccine is something that definitely seems to have set us apart. So I know I only have a short time to share, but what I want to do is, as a psychologist and also as one with faith, I just briefly, very briefly, want to introduce some practical steps in looking at, our faith-based and also psychological understandings in the process really of decision making. And I think it's important to correlate the two, because we know that our faith principles also help to guide our decision making, and also that research indicates that there is a positive correlation between faith and also psychological well-being. So the next things I'm just going to mention are some of those steps I'd like us to consider in whether we decide to take the vaccine or whether we decide not to take the vaccine. So, I'm going to start from a place of being proactive rather than reactive. So when we're talking about being proactive, what we're talking about is being able to own our own decisions, our actions, and being instrumental in determining the outcomes, rather than being reactive, which is basically to respond after a thing or perhaps to react to somebody else's actions. Being proactive requires a calmness, it requires reflection, autonomy, which is about our self-governing, and also empowerment. We need to feel empowered to be able to be proactive in whatever decisions we make. Any decision made is certainly best made purposefully and timely. And I'm hoping that the next few points that I'm about to go through as well will help us to make that proactive rather than reactive decision about whether we want to take the vaccine or not. So research is really important. And this is what we're doing here tonight, which is amazing to see. It's important that we are able and feel able to conduct our own research, which is to apply that systematic investigation into something. And so to also realize that we don't just have to accept what we are told, no matter who it is that is telling us. Curiosity is actually a really good thing. And it's important that we can make a decision from an informed place. And that also means that we need to be able to ask questions. Research isn't simply about just looking at a number of sources and taking them at face value, but it's also about the ability to ask questions and to also to look at the conclusions that have been drawn already and still to feel able to ask questions. With anything that we are presented with, it's so important to know that you can actually inquire further, that you can challenge what you're being told, and also to know that you can also seek clarification. Research and asking questions, interestingly, took me to a particular scripture, and that was in Matthew 16, verse 13. And it's a very famous scripture where Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" And then they say, quite quickly, some say you're John the Baptist, some say that you're Elijah, others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And then he says to them, "But who do you say I am?" Now, when we look at this passage, first of all, what we see is that Jesus wants to know, what is the general opinion? What's the gossip? What is the word around town? And in my opinion, I think they were quite quick to answer, because there were many opinions and they were all well known, and they were opinions that could be easily recited back. But when he asked, "Who do you say I am?" I believe there could have been a little bit of a pause before Simon Peter spoke up and he answered who Jesus was. But we definitely see that there was a silence from the others. Who do you say requires an internal look, an internal questioning, and oftentimes that for us becomes the sticking point. In this current situation that we are faced right now, it's easy for us to quote what we see and also what we hear. But what does that actually mean in terms of what we are saying and of what we believe? So many questions, are going around, and asking questions isn't just an external quest, no, but it's actually an internal inquiry as well. Because there are many credible and also unreliable sources of information concerning the vaccine. And it's important that we do not only understand what is being said around us, but also that we search within ourselves to understand what all of that means actually within us. Also, to yield our will to God. Something that is important to admit is that at least for a year now, things have not gone according to plan. I can certainly say that about my own life. And it's funny how we make plans for our day, for our week, for our months, even for our year or years in advance. But actually, we never really know what could happen today or if we will even get to tomorrow. And I'm reminded in Matthew 6, verse 34, where it says, don't worry about tomorrow because each day has enough trouble of its own. And that's certainly what we're seeing now. Each day does seem to have significant troubles of its own. And the verse before actually reminds us that what we actually need to do is seek God first. So for some, the decision about the vaccine may be about trying to get back a sense of normality in life. And for others, it may be about a fear of what the future implications could be. We do, as a people, like to plan and feel like we are in control of our lives. And yet, we probably have never felt as vulnerable and lacking in control as we actually do right now. In deciding whether or not to take the vaccine, I think it's so important that we acknowledge our limited capacity and also that need for direction. And that's as a people of faith. Examining ourselves. It's so important to examine ourselves because it's easy to get so caught up and carried along with everything that is taking place. And actually what we do is we forget to check in with ourselves. Now, however you are feeling about COVID-19 and however you are feeling about the vaccine, I want to say is actually valid. And why is it valid? Because it's how you feel and only you can experience that. As a British culture, we talk of a stiff upper lip. As men, we talk about being strong. As women, we talk about being a container for the family. As children and young people, it's about having life too easy. And as Black people, it's often about pride. There are so many things that dictate how we should cope with life and with the things that we go through that oftentimes there is no room for our experiences and our feelings. And sometimes we react out of our emotions, and guess what? We don't even realize it. We project our internal feelings onto others. We get at the wife or the husband or the kids. And, if we were really to check in with ourselves, it's our own internal battles that we are truly struggling with. And when examining ourselves, it's important to know that we don't have to cope alone. Should you experience depression, anxiety, feel overwhelmed or anything else at this moment, it's important that we also know that we can reach out for support. Support from our pastors, from our family, from friends, from our GP. There is things such as the Association of Christian Counsellors, or we know that there are other counsellors as well. There's Premier Lifeline. We know that there's things such as Shout, which is a crisis tech service. There is Mind, which we know offer numerous forms of support and information. Also to responsibility. And I want to say this point really carefully, as I do understand that some are experiencing a degree of pressure to take the vaccine, and also that our historical experiences have led to a degree of mistrust and has fueled a fear. And these are very real. But I think it's also important that we acknowledge our choice. I think the danger in feeling forced to take the vaccine means we negate our responsibility. And yes, sometimes that may mean that we may feel as though there is someone to blame should something not work out the way we would like it to. I think the bigger concern is that it contributes to trauma and mistrust. As a people, we already carry a weight of many things that were forced upon our forefathers and that we are living the consequences of today. And I know that there are real fears about employment and travel restrictions should we choose not to take the vaccine. But what I also know is that we have the right to exercise our free will and must also acknowledge our responsibility in that. Sometimes, decision making to me is also about the psychological damage that occurs as a result of having no choice about what happens to us and how that also filters down the generations. So faith and fear. I was actually going to say faith over fear, because as Christians, we aspire to live faith-based lives. My reservation was that often we see faith as an absence of fear. And certainly that experiencing fear means that there is an absence of faith. But actually, fear can be quite a good thing. I fear fire enough to know not to play with it, for example, or to touch it, as beautiful as it may look. But I also have the faith to know that when I need to cook my food or I need to light the fireplace, this same fire is the very thing that is going to help me. So my faith helps me to know that I can use fire for the purposes that it was created. But the same fear will cause me not to, say, go to sleep with the fireplace left on or leave the house with the stove on. And I actually feel that at times there is a place for both. But what happens is that God gives us a coping mechanism for fear, and that is faith. There are so many scriptures which speak on fear. I didn't even know which to choose, but there are so many. And I believe that this is because God knows that fear is a very real challenge that confronts us all the time. We are living in anxious times, and there is a saying that says that we fear the unknown. And these are certainly roads that for most of us, we have not walked before. Fearing COVID or the vaccine doesn't necessarily mean that you lack faith. Taking the vaccine doesn't mean that you lack faith. And I feel it's important that we apply faith in any decision that we make. And also to know that your faith level is not dependent on your decision to take or not to take the vaccine, but actually that your faith level can guide that decision either way. Another thing I want to talk about is unity, because something that I've personally been quite saddened to see is how divisive the idea of the vaccine has been. I've observed many social media conversations where people might raise a question on taking a vaccine and receive some really strong, opinionated, offensive, sometimes judgmental comments. And that this is causing a lot of division, but also is very silencing for people. Some, for example, are having to hide the fact that they have taken the vaccine, and others are openly condemning people, whether they choose to take the vaccine or whether they've decided not to take the vaccine. What we do know is that racial hierarchy in slavery contributed to division as a people. And what we also know is that differences in doctrines and principles has resulted in many church denominations. So as a Black people of faith, we're already subject to faith-based and race-based divisions. And what is difficult to see is that while it isn't possible for us to differ in opinions, to unbiasedly share feelings and experiences without it resulting in further divisions. And here I was reminded of Ephesians 4, verse 2 and 3, which says, it reminds us to be humble, gentle, and patient, to make allowances for one another, and to do what we can to keep unity and the bond of peace. And I think it's so important to remember that there is more uniting us than there is dividing us. And whatever we decide in regards to the vaccine is so important to be able to respect the decision of others and to do what we can do our best to live in peace and harmony. And also to not have to feel that we have to lean on our own understanding. As a people of faith, we often quote Proverbs 3 verses 5, which reminds us to trust in the Lord and not to lean on our own understanding. And why is this important in our decision making? Because we can't always trust our feelings, and we can't always trust what we see and what we hear. So whilst most of what I'm saying is encouraging us to engage with our feelings and to engage with research, we also must have Christ at the centre of our decision making. When seeking God about the vaccine, remember that his plans are to give us hope and a future, to give us an expected end, and also that he will keep us in perfect peace, when our minds are stayed on him. And I tell you what, that's quite a consolation that we have to know that God actually does want the best for us. And we also have a hope to know that nothing that we do, we have to do alone. And that is also including in making our decisions. Which brings me nicely on to the next point, which is to listen. Because, I'm one who often jokes about keyboard warriors, and in this present day, we also have a lot of blog philosophers. Everybody's got so much to say, but sometimes what happens is when we're saying so much, what we do is we forget to actually listen, and so we can be quite strongly opinionated, especially from behind the scenes. And sometimes our issue isn't that we're a victim of external influences, but actually that we can become sometimes so self-assured that we leave no room to learn or to listen to wise counsel or those who may have experience. Sadly, I have spoken to a few who have said, this COVID-19 isn't that real, or the restrictions don't necessarily apply to me. And there is one of those people that today I know have passed on the very same thing. And in our decision making, we can't purely rely on our own intuition, but actually we do have to have a degree of openness, of teachability, and certainly of good counsel, which, I just want to share again a scripture with you to back up what I'm saying, which is in Proverbs 11, verse 14. And it says, where there is no counsel, the people fail, but in a multitude of counsel, there is safety. So we know it's so important that we can go to people and ask for advice and speak about our opinions and feel able to share. And also to know that sometimes what we're feeling and experiencing, somebody else is also feeling and experiencing it, and just being able to talk things through and to hear others can really help us, with how we're feeling and with making wise decisions. I also want to say, you matter. And I think this is an important point to highlight, because I think irrespective of what church, of what government, family or employers, whatever other cultural groups that you belong to have to say about the vaccine, I want to remind you that fundamentally it is a personal decision. Oftentimes we do allow guilt and shame and doubt to be behind our decision making. And sometimes we don't feel very confident about the decisions we make. And with every decision, there will be an element of anxiety. And the reason being is because with every decision that we do make, there was an alternative choice that we didn't, and we know that new and uncommon things, and things that we don't understand necessarily, we don't want to be the first. And we also know that we don't like being the one that goes against the grain. And so sometimes we allow those feelings to guide our decision making. We have a tendency to want to go with the crowd or what appears to be the popular decision within the cultural groups that we belong to. And in this season, something that is sure is that we've all been forced out of our comfort zones, and that having to make a decision about taking the vaccine or not is certainly not a comfortable nor an easy one. However we feel or think about the vaccine, we are making a decision which ought to be right for you and for your personal circumstances. We can't see the future. We can't know what the outcome will be for sure, but in the here and now, you need to be able to be comfortable and confident in whatever it is that you decide to do. So in summarizing, I want to encourage us all to make our decision to take the vaccine or not to take the vaccine prayerfully. And that's in the literal term of praying about the decision that we make, and also in the points that I've raised, which is proactive and not reactive, through research, through asking questions, in yielding our will to God, in examining ourselves, responsibility, faith and understanding the place of fear, in unity, leaning not on our own understanding, listening and remembering that we matter. Thank you for listening. I'm going to hand back to the host.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Amanda. A wealth of information, a deep mine that we could dive into. You reminded us so importantly, 11 things I reckon that you said: to be proactive, to research, to be prayerful, to have unity, faith and fear, responsibility. These are key issues. And I could just relate a few more to you because they resonated with me, and sure it connects with our audience. But I want to try and give as much time as we can for questions later, because you raised some very interesting points there. Faith in deciding, but that could go either way: faith to take or faith not to take. And so that's a very interesting point for us to consider as we go forward. And so, thank you again. And last but not least, we have Dr. William Ackler, who's going to weave all this together in a theological reflection. Dr. William, thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Powell, and thank you everybody for attending. So I've quite a hard task to try and bring all this together, but because we want to get to the questions, let me try and be brief and think about this reflection in 3 principal points. Let's think about contextual concerns, why people might have legitimate concerns from our community. Then let's think about contested concerns, why the way in which we think about these concerns, stemming from our history and experience, can sometimes take us down some problematic avenues. And then thirdly, let's think about some biblical tips that we can think about holistically that can help us make some good and wise decisions in relation to the vaccine and health overall. And I like that the seminar is framed as holistic health, because we have to think about the health of our whole community and what has happened to our communities. And perhaps that's where our concerns actually stem from. That historically, as people who have experienced the injustice of enslavement, the injustice of colonialism, the injustice of persistent discrimination, and we've called out to the wider society to recognize these injustices and do something about it. So when we've asked for compensation and justice, oftentimes what we've received is information and solace. So rather than deal with the problems that we experience and what we face, we get this call, well, we just give you some more information and we're sorry for what has happened. So maybe there's a call on us as church leaders, as theologians, that when we think about what has happened in the current pandemic, that as we ask people to consider the vaccine, that we also make the bigger call for compensation and for justice. Why is it that in Black communities, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, we are much more likely to get COVID, much more likely to die from COVID? And that is because of systematic racial injustices that have been perpetrated against us. So if we are the most vulnerable groups, the groups that have suffered the most, why is it that the societies that we are living in, why are they not offering us better opportunities? Why are they not protecting us more in our jobs? Why are they not offering us extended furloughs? Why are they not shielding us so that we become less exposed to this? Why do they only come when it's time to give information as opposed to give compensation and justice? I think these two things are linked. People are much more likely to listen to the information about vaccines if as a society you show that you care about them more broadly, that you show you're concerned about their justice issues, their ethical issues, then we're going to be much more likely then to want to take a vaccine. Distrust happens because our justice has been denied us. So that's an important question that I think people have raised, that some concerns are legitimate. But when we have these concerns because of our history and our experience, there are sometimes that we're led down a path where we distrust all knowledge. But the Bible tells us in Hosea 4:6, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. We need knowledge. Science and theology are not opposites. They should work together. The better informed we are, the more knowledge we have, the better decisions we can make. And we need to be people of evidence, not people of speculation and people of conspiracy. Even when in the biblical times people face very difficult situations. You can think about the book of Daniel, where people were enslaved and sent into exile. But Daniel 1:20 tells us of the Hebrew young people that in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. 10 times better in every area of knowledge. When people experience discrimination, oppression, we can't afford then to lack wisdom and knowledge. We need more wisdom and more knowledge to help us get through these situations. Proverbs 18:15 tells us, the heart of the discerning acquires knowledge. The ears of the wise seek it out. And Proverbs 4:7 and 8 tells us, wisdom is supreme. Therefore get wisdom, though it cost all you have, get understanding. Wisdom and knowledge are the keys to help us to make good decisions. Unfortunately, as I say, sometimes because of circumstances, mistrust of authorities, mistrust of academic knowledge and wisdom, we might tend to then want to move in another direction, to the internet and other sources that oftentimes are not verified. But again, there are some theological tips and wisdoms that we might want to think about. So Isaiah chapter 8:19 and 20 talks about that when men tell you to consult mediums and spiritists who whisper and mutter, should not a people inquire of their God? Why consult the dead on behalf of the living? To the law and to the testimony, if they speak not according to this word, they have no light of dawn. That suggests to me that we need an objective measure by which you evaluate information. Here it's the law and the testimony. So don't listen to, in a sense, unreliable, unreferenced internet sources on the latest theory. You must interrogate all the knowledge that you receive. We want to rightly interrogate the science of vaccinations, but in the same way, are we interrogating the science of the internet whisperers? Are we verifying whether what they're actually telling us is accurate? Are we giving them the same level of scrutiny? 2 Corinthians 13:1 tells us that every matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. When it comes to academic work, scientific work, that's why their work is peer reviewed. You understand the process by which, for example, a vaccine is developed. You can read about how it was developed, why it was developed, the processes that were undertaken for that process, and you can evaluate and ask legitimate questions. Can we ask questions of people that say this vaccine is a 5G conspiracy, part of the mark of the beast? Can that be verified? Where are the sources to verify that kind of information? If it can't be verified, is it reliable information or is it just speculation? So, like I say, if you want to be rigorous about the vaccine, how it came about, what its efficacy is, you need to be rigorous about the conspiracy theory. How efficacious are those? And oftentimes, even when you do a nominal search to look for those 2 or 3 witnesses for reliable sources, you can't find them. But you have to take the time to actually look and scrutinize and to investigate. And at least in that sense, when you do that, you're able to make a more informed and wise judgment. And the last point is comes to us from the book of Romans 12:1, where the Bible says, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. That here the Bible is telling us that our bodies are important. That's a spiritual exercise to look after our bodies. And I'm sure our doctors will be able to tell us during the question time that part of us being more vulnerable to COVID is our comorbidities, high blood pressure, diabetes, other instances that are high and prevalent in our communities. Oftentimes these causes come diet, lifestyle, stress, systematic racism, all causing these things to be a part of us, making us more vulnerable. But if our bodies are living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, then we need to take holistically better care of our bodies. That we need to demonstrate and show love in our communities. And the onus then becomes on all of us to take better care of our communities. And we need not fear, because the Bible tells us God has not given us a spirit of fear, but He's given us a spirit of love, power, and of a sound mind. So please be wise. Try to avoid conspiracy theories. Use verifiable evidence and make informed choices that protects your own body, but also our broader body, that of our community, which is so important. So go back to our hosts.
Thank you so much, Dr. William, for your theological and biblical analysis to help our discussion about the vaccine this evening. Thank you for reminding us to seek knowledge, for reminding us of the perishing that takes place, for lacking the seeking of knowledge, and for your encouragement to interrogate all of the knowledge that we received in a balanced way, and to watch out for unconfirmed, unreferenced sources. Thank you for highlighting the difference between interrogation and speculation. Thank you so much. And we look forward to hearing from you in the next section of our evening. So we're now going to move into our plenary session, where we're going to go to our expert panelists to hear some of your questions. We've been having, as Bishop said earlier, a whole variety of questions flooding through over the last couple of weeks. And this is now an opportunity to hear them. So I'm now going to go to Professor Webley for the first question of the evening from our COGOP and international audience, which is: what percentage of BAME, Black, Asian, minority ethnic, took part in the testing of the vaccine? And since the trial/testing of the vaccine, what has been the reported side effects? Over to you, Professor Webley.
Thank you very much. So about 9.3, 9.7% of the for the Pfizer Moderna vaccines had African Americans, people of ethnic minority, were a part of the clinical trials for those. And one of the challenges is that they've had a hard time recruiting people of minority populations in these studies, again, for the systematic racism and the health impacts that were mentioned prior to. When they looked at side effects, the side effects in these populations were no different from what they saw in the Caucasian population. And I'm talking about having about 4-point-something% with swelling or pain at the injection site, having overall fatigue, maybe about 4.8% of people had that for some of these vaccines. Feeling just tired overall. That means your immune system is working. That's what happens when you get a good vaccine. Your immune system kicks in, it starts working. So when you start feeling tired and fatigued, you should actually say, hallelujah, that vaccine is actually working for you. But again, the overall side effects, and I can share later a source that people can go to find that information, were pretty similar across all ethnic and racial backgrounds in the studies.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Webley. Greatly appreciated. Let me then move to our next question. Again, based on the vaccine, and I'd ask Dr. Garrick. Dr. Garrick, is there any evidence, verifiable evidence, of anyone who has died as a result of taking the vaccine? We know in the UK, the millions that have taken the vaccine thus far, and maybe likewise in the United States, it's a little bit behind. Is there any evidence anywhere in our world that anyone has died as a result of taking the vaccine?
Thank you for that question. I certainly have not seen that evidence or heard of that evidence. One thing I will say about the integrity and the ethics of the scientific community, you'd have seen from one of the vaccine trials, for example, as soon as individuals within that trials was reported as being sick, that trial was paused until it was ascertained what was really going on before it could continue. And in the same way, if somebody had suffered some form of adverse effect whereby it led to a fatality, I think that investigation would have been prolonged and would have gone on much longer. But we haven't thus far had any reports of anyone dying having taken the vaccine.
Okay, thank you. That question repeated itself a number of times. Over to you, Shamara.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question that we've had for our scientific panelist is, why has the UK death rate risen so much when the country where the virus was created is so low? Are they treating this differently? Over to you, Dr. Garrick.
And again, this might be a matter, there are many complex issues here, but this might be a matter of government policy. I think a lot of scrutiny has gone into, for example, the reprieve period just leading up to Christmas, in that few days in terms of allowing individuals to travel to different places and do other things. In a meeting earlier this year where the chief scientific advisor to the UK government was presenting, one of the things that he said was that as early as January, he was concerned about things that he saw in China and thought that this country perhaps should have closed its border much earlier. And in fact, we were looking at individuals coming from China region to say that they will be carrying the virus into this particular country, when ultimately it turned out that the virus came to us through Europe, places like Spain and Italy, which we subsequently got known to have become ravaged with this particular virus. And so really that's one of the reasons why it spread, because it came through doors that we weren't naturally expecting it to come through. Well, another reason why it's spread. Again, as I said, that the decision about when we should open and close the country, the decision about opening certain places like pubs and restaurants where people go and drink excessively, these are potentially contributing factors, not necessarily science, but political decisions. Because on one hand, we have to balance here. It's about the economy as well. And health and well-being is not just about what's happening physically, but what's happening with our livelihoods. And if we're not able to earn and make money if our businesses are closing, for example, that's going to affect our health and well-being as well. So there are all these other priorities to take into consideration. And of course, we learned early on there about the ineffectiveness of the test and trace system, that initially when it started out in the UK, it wasn't necessarily doing well. That improved over time. And as a result, we're much more able to keep on top of testing and tracing the virus now. But there are several factors which could have contributed to that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Garrick. And as you can see, we're moving swiftly with these questions so we can get as many in as is possible. My next question is to Dr. Acker. Dr. Acker, do you believe that this pandemic is evidence of God's wrath or his judgment upon mankind?
Not really. No. I think that we've seen pandemics, haven't we, as Professor Webley outlined throughout history, that pandemics come. So it becomes difficult to ascribe that any one specific thing to God. What does that tell us then? What are we saying about God? That a God that loves us is visiting that particular wrath on us doesn't really square with that overall idea of a loving God that cares for us, that sacrificed his son on the cross for us. What we can understand is that evil is prevalent in the world. And with evil being prevalent in the world, disease is also prevalent in the world. But we don't have to then ascribe that to a God that loves us.
Well, thank you. Shamara?
Yes. Also to Dr. William, another question that's come in is, how does a Christian believer deserve God whether or not to take the vaccine?
Sorry, I missed the last part. Can you repeat that again?
Yes, no worries. So the question is, how does a Christian believer discern the will of God as to whether or not to take the vaccine?
Again, as a Christian, I suppose you have to pray, think about it. As I say, use wisdom, look at the best information, think about then what's best for you and your family. And again, there might be some medical input, because for different people, so you have to balance out what is your risk and your reward. What is the risk to you and your family and the people that you care about by taking the vaccine or not taking the vaccine? So I think you have to pray about it, and like I say, seek the best advice, the best and most reliable advice to make the appropriate decision.
Thank you. Over to you, Bishop.
Thank you. And I have a question for Dr. Bishop wrote two questions in actual fact. So let me read them to you. Dr. Amanda, first question. Are there any classical mental health symptoms arising from being locked down for the extended periods of times that we have been in the UK? That's to Dr. Amanda. And Bishop Rowe, working also in this field, are there any preventative measures to ensure a sustained healthy mindset during these challenging times? Dr. Amanda.
Okay, so I think the lockdown has had quite a knock-on effect on our psychological well-being in a number of ways. And so we know that some of the things are, it has led to an increase in isolation. We know also it's led to increased anxiety. And because, as I mentioned earlier, it's impacted our socialization, it's really impacted our relationships. That's relationships with our families within the home, that's relationships externally as well. Even just things such as commuting, something that a lot of us haven't necessarily had to do, or our interaction with others. So there is a lot of sort of fear that has been that has been increased in us in terms of even how we interact with each other. We've lost things such as just human touch, being able to hug, our loved ones, even say, for example, not even necessarily someone who may not live in your house, who might be in the hospital or elsewhere, but even just in terms of, okay, so I work in, say, the hospital, and I've now come home and my kids want to run at me at the door and give me a hug, and even just in that in itself. And so there's a lot of, fear and anxiety that has definitely been created. And also, I think there's been, a lot of confusion as well around, what is acceptable and what isn't, and how we can now relate to each other. Although we've learned to develop new ways, we're all interacting as we are now online. But what it's done is it's also changed what we know to be how we relate, how we interact. And so, yes, there's been huge. We could sort of talk about it for a long time. I hope I've answered the question, but those are, I think, some of the main things that we're seeing at the moment in terms of some of the psychological impacts of the lockdown. And also as well, just to say that that's over generations, because children who are used to going into their classrooms and seeing friends are not understanding why we're no longer going to school. And that's having an impact on them educationally, and it's also having an impact on their social skills, on the young people who have been denied, leavers balls or, their exams and all those sorts of things as well. So that's had a knock-on effect on their psychological well-being. So not only are they feeling more isolated, not only is it impacting their current relationships as well, but at the same time as well, it's also, having a knock-on effect on things such as depression. So we're seeing increase in depression where people had plans and they've worked really hard, for exams and, what the end of the year or what leaving school would look like. And having had that denied, we know has led to, an increase in depression. We know it's impacting upon relationships as well, because, we're now having prolonged periods of time with people in our home whereby we may have, escapisms. You might go out with the lads or the girls, or, you're now having to not only be around your family, you're homeschooling them, and you're still having to work, but from home, and all these different things that is thrown up. So we're definitely seeing an increase in depression and in anxiety, in relational breakdowns, in limited socialization and all those sorts of areas as well.
Right. Thank you. And Bishop Rowe, preventative measures?
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Bishop. I think there are many things that one could do. For example, the input to the mind is very, very powerful. And where you find people get onto places like the internet, you have a lot of information coming through WhatsApp and a lot of social media sites. And these things are fed into the mind. They're not verifiable. And so they impact the individual, leading to negative thoughts and all manner of things that affect the individual. So I think one way of preventing this is to depend on reliable information, to trust people that you know will help you, people that are wise, people that will give you guidance, good guidance. I also think exercise is a wonderful thing. Instead of sitting indoors, just get a walk outside, release yourself, allow your muscles to work, allow your mind to work, listen to good music, not some of these things that feed the mind with negative things. And also, I think eating well, eating healthily, sleeping, giving yourself time to think and to digest sound information, I think can prevent a lot of these things that are happening.
Thank you, Bishop Rowe. Over to Shamara. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bishop. We've actually had a question come in from our live audience to the whole panel, of which any of you can choose to answer, which is, would you take the vaccine? And if so, why?
I
Can
can
I
chime
answer
in.
that?
I absolutely will. I haven't yet gone to the place where it's my group yet, but the moment that happens, I'll be happy to take the vaccine. My wife, who is a frontline worker, has already gotten both doses of the Pfizer vaccine, and the reason I would take it is because I've looked at all of the studies, I've looked at all of the data, I've personally analyzed it, and I've found the information to be credible. And I have found the side effects from the vaccine to be within the range of what is expected for a vaccine. I have seen nothing there that would say that this is something that's going to have long-term effects, which I think is one of the things that people are afraid of, especially with the mRNA vaccine. It's a new technology, and people are thinking maybe there's a long-term effect from it. One of the things you need to know is when the Food and Drug Administration went back and analyzed data over the past 50 years on vaccine effects or adverse events from vaccines, what they realized is that adverse events almost overwhelmingly came within a 2-month period after you got the second dose of the vaccine. And that's why both of the mRNA vaccine companies waited for that period of time before they applied for emergency use authorization. And so for those reasons, I would certainly take the vaccine. And my wife has taken the vaccine. She's totally fine.
And
Yeah,
any other
yes,
panelists?
I would take it. As I say, measuring risk and reward, COVID seems like a nasty illness, and that the potential of what it can do to your body, the damage it can cause. Whereas when you, like you say, when you see the reports around the vaccine, that's the risk seems much more minimal compared to the risk of greater illness. And I was thinking about it rather facetiously, but actually has a certain kind of validity. That you think about what's happening in the European Union at the moment, white on white trade wars to keep hold of more of the vaccine. So if they thought it was dangerous to their populations, why are they engaging in these great political struggle in order to hoard the vaccine and have so much vaccine nationalism? So if it's good enough for the broader white population and they're, like I say, they're hoarding it, keeping it, not wanting to send it to other places, then we can say again that there's a degree of safety and some minimal risk there.
Interesting.
If I may come in here,
Yes, Dr.
if the host will allow me.
Yes, Dr. Garrett, go ahead.
Thank you. I was asked a very similar question in another forum last year. And at that time, my response was not yet. And that was primarily to review the data that was presented and also to look at it from not only a theological or a faith approach, but also from a scientific approach as well. Having reviewed the data, there is, from my perspective, nothing outstanding that says to me that the vaccine is not safe and that I should not take the vaccine. As a result, I'm quite open to taking the vaccine and will take the vaccine when it is offered to me. And I think a lot of fears around this sometimes, and we've heard this many, many times, perhaps people are concerned that there is some genetic manipulation that will take place here, especially from the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine. Can I just state for the record that it won't be the case from what we know about the fundamentals of biology, and I'm sure Professor Webley will back me up here, is that there's nothing in the RNA sequence that will allow it to traffic to the nucleus of your cell, which is where your genetic material is based. It, in fact, takes on what we know about a viral life cycle, in that what happens when a virus gets into your cell, it uncoats, which means it opens up, releases its genetic material, and as was shown in the professor's presentation earlier, uses the machinery of the cell to build new viral particles, which are then released to cause more systematic infection should the immune system not be good at combating it. It's a very similar principle that we have in operation here, in that your body, the machinery of your body, will see the RNA molecule that carries the message to make the spike protein, which is that protein on the surface of the virus, and basically make more of that proteins presented on the surface of your cells, which then primes the immune system or trains the immune system to identify and to attack it, such that if you ever in the future come into contact with the real virus, your immune system would have created enough memory and enough immunity against this virus to attack it and deal with it immediately. And really, that's what it does. It offers this level of safety and protection. Yes, there are outstanding questions such as, does it stop you from passing on the virus to another person? Because not getting the effects or the impact of the disease that the virus causes is different rather to being a carrier of the virus. So there are a number of questions that are still being ironed out behind the scenes, but certainly from a safety perspective, from a science perspective, having reviewed it, I see no issues with taking the vaccine.
Thank you so much for your transparency. Over to you, Bishop Tedroy.
Thank you. And so we'll move again back to, let me say, the core, the science here. And there is a question we read. While we hear of the vaccine, we know that there are various types of vaccines. Could you explain the difference between mRNA vaccines, Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, etc., and viral vector vaccines, AstraZeneca and Sputnik, also Sinovac, in a way that lay people can understand? So I'm directing that to Professor Webley.
So glad that these questions are being asked, Bishop, because I think this is at the heart of people getting to a place where you're going to be comfortable making a decision whether or not to take this vaccine. As Dr. Wilson just explained, these mRNA vaccines are the new kids on the block. And essentially what they do, they actually utilize the protein making factory of the cell to make the protein that you want the body to be immunized against, right? So you have this message that is trafficked into the body through injection of these lipid nanoparticles that contain the messenger RNA. And remember, all that the messenger RNA is coding for is that spike protein. It's not the whole virus, just that spike protein. Because all you want is to make that. And the reason why that is so important is that that is actually what the virus uses to bind to your cells. As I described it in my presentation, it is the key that the virus uses to unlock the door of your cells in order to get in. Until the virus actually gets inside of your cell, until its genetic material actually enters the cell, all that the virus is just an inert particle. It is when it enters your cell, then it can replicate, then it can make tens of thousands of copies of itself. For the viral vector vaccines, and there are plenty of them, this is the type of vaccine that was made against Ebola, right? This is how the Ebola vaccine was made. And essentially what they've done is that they've gotten what in essence is a Trojan horse virus. These are adenoviruses, respiratory viruses. And in this case, they got one from a monkey strain of the virus. They have gutted it. In other words, they have transformed it so that it doesn't replicate when it's injected inside of you. And all that it does then is that the DNA is released. So they got the RNA of this spike protein, still making a spike protein in the host. They printed the DNA of that, integrated that DNA into the adenovirus DNA, because adenoviruses are DNA viruses. And now the adenovirus will infect the cells. So it can infect, but it can't replicate. So it becomes a Trojan horse that takes in this piece of coronavirus DNA. Once it gets inside of the cell, it makes its way, this DNA now makes its way into the nucleus where it gets a messenger RNA copied off for that protein. That protein now goes out, that messenger RNA goes out into the ribosome, the cytoplasm, makes that spike protein, and that now gets released from the cells, and the immune system attacks it in pretty much the same way it did the Pfizer and BioNTech vaccine and the Moderna vaccines. It's just a different way of introducing it. We call it a different platform for introducing the vaccine. So you have a non-replicative, non-lethal, non-disease-causing virus that is carrying in this message that you want the body to create a protein from. So that's the major difference between these two vaccine platforms.
Thank you. Over to Shamara.
Thank you so much for that. We've had another question come in from our live audience this evening. From an eschatological point of view, end time doctrine, is this vaccine a sign of the mark of the beast? And that's for you, Dr. William.
Simply, no. Again, what's the evidence to suggest that a vaccine is the mark of the beast? Maybe if I can just make then a more broader point. Science or vaccines of themselves are not intrinsically good or evil. We're here using computers and Zoom to carry out this event. We're not saying that this computer is the mark of the beast or is intrinsically evil. It's what people do with these things that determine whether they are good or evil, not the things in themselves. So that's what we need to think about. Are we influencing the ethics of behavior and practice of people? And as Dr. Garrick and Professor Webley outlined, that they're doctors, so they work to ethical standards. Historically, we've seen some bad doctors, Nazi Germany, break their ethicals to do bad practice, genetically do some terrible things. We've seen, what do they call those things, where you use weapons, where you use vaccines or derivatives to generate weapons, but that's people. So you've got vaccines that heal people. You've got vaccines that they use to, not vaccines, but I've forgotten the term, but the kind of weapons, biological weapons. So where you use biological weapons to kill people. So you can use science for good or for ill, but I would say yes, that this vaccine, no, is certainly not the mark of the beast.
Thank you. Over to you, Bishop.
Thank you. One of the things we will be doing, because you can imagine we're getting responses right around the world, and there is someone that's refuting your response a short while ago, Dr. Garrick, where the individual claims that in Norway, 29 deaths have been reported, 7 people reported around the world, and there are people that have died in Germany, and 53 deaths in Gibraltar. I guess those things would have to be researched. Not sure where that evidence is arising from, but I just thought I'll share that with you. The other questions that we really wanted was to engage our metropolitan mayor from a socio-political standpoint. But before I do, I can see that Dr. Wilmore is raising his hand, maybe to counter this person's statistics.
Yes, this is one of the stories that have been spun, so to speak. What this story hasn't said is to distinguish the difference between dying after you've received the vaccine versus dying as a result of the vaccine. Now in Norway, they have about 400 people dying each week in these nursing homes. So the area that they're vaccinating now are people over 70, right? Average age, I think 76, right? They have about 400 people a week dying in that age group. Many individuals are taken to these hospice care facilities so that they can die. right? And so when these individuals are given the vaccine, were given the vaccine, there was no increase in the average number of people dying per week. So when you think about it, Bishop, if I give 10 million people $50, within 2 weeks, statistics says that about 14,000 people will die. Are those people dying because I gave them $50? No. It's just a matter of numbers. And so if you don't understand these numbers in epidemiology, then you could easily blame something on an entity that has no relationship. In fact, at the time when they started seeing lung cancer in the early 1900s, people blamed it on matches because they realized this is people who were carrying matches around in their pockets. Matches had just become popular, who were dying from lung cancer. So they said, stop carrying matches. It is the matches that's making you have lung cancer, not realizing that the people who carry matches carry because they're smoking cigars and cigarettes. And that was leading to it. So we have to separate the facts from the fiction. There was no increase in death. In fact, all of the reports that have come out of Norway have said, yes, we will look at the data more closely because, of course, you have to. But there is absolutely no indication that these individuals died because they took the vaccine. They just died after they had received the vaccine. Moreover, it is my thought that some of these individuals probably should not have gotten the vaccine because they were very old, and many of these individuals were very fragile and had weeks or a month left to live. And if you give a vaccine like this that's driving a strong immune response, just that febrile or fever or cytokines that are coming from the cells, from the immune cells, could actually make that person more sick in the short term. And if that person doesn't have the physical strength to overcome that short period of immune boost, they could actually be in jeopardy of dying, not because there's something inherently dangerous about the vaccine, but because they're in a group of individuals who probably shouldn't have gotten the vaccine. And I see that Dr. Wilson wants to comment as well.
Thank you. Yes. Dr. Wilson?
Thank you for that, Professor Webley. I think you have summarized that excellently. And I think I will still stick with my initial answer in that there is no evidence of death occurring as a result of taking the vaccine. And let me just make the point much more succinctly, rather. There's a difference between taking the vaccine and dying as a result of taking the vaccine. And I think that's something that we need to keep into mind when we bring up these statistics and different cases. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Greatly appreciated. And to our audience, the interest is growing by the minute, and you would have observed that we have gone well over time, because of your interest. And so we just want to take a few more questions. So we ask you to stay with us. It's important. Now, I want to move to the socio-political perspective. Because one question that Shamara and I have come across frequently is that of what are the issues around not taking the vaccine as it relates to employment? Is there going to be a vaccine passport? And we really wanted someone within the political sphere of decision making to engage with us on that. But unfortunately, the mayor wasn't able to do so. Or indeed the health secretary. We're hoping that maybe on our subsequent program next week, Sunday, we will have someone from that sphere of authority to speak to these issues. But I'd love to know what the panelists, what your thoughts are. The issues around employment, and do you see, as some prophets are saying, that there's going to be a COVID passport by November of this year? Love to hear from each of the panelists on that.
Can I just say we live in a world
I hope not. Go ahead, Dr. Wilson.
All right, and I'll go, and then perhaps you could come in. Can I just say we live in a world whereby Perhaps very few things are surprising anymore. And I think the last year or so has taught us that very much so. And so, if there's currently no legislation in place that would suggest that, however, can such a legislation come into being? I think we shouldn't be naive and say that it cannot. For people of faith, what if it is said that you cannot gather for congregational worship until you show that you've been certified as being vaccinated? What would that then do for you? Would you change your perspective on that? Also, I think a lot of people are getting UK fatigue and perhaps want to leave the country and travel somewhere. And maybe another, maybe not this government, but maybe governments of other territory will put that law in place that you won't be able to travel in until you are being certified as having taken the vaccine. Do you then go ahead with your travel plans, or do you restrict your travel plans? And from an employment perspective, of course, again, there is no statutory legislation in place to say that employers can force this upon you. But then here's a question, also one of ethics. What do you do if you work in a healthcare setting, especially in settings where there's a high prevalence of COVID-19 infections, and you are prone to being infected with this virus? One of the things we learned from the first lockdown in the UK is that people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds working in the healthcare sector was significantly affected by this. So do we say to our people, keep going back to work without any form of protection? And for some of these people, you can't work from home. So do you continue to go out there within the real world, having not been protected? I hope it doesn't get to a place where law has to enforce us to be vaccine compliant. And I hope that our civil liberties and our freedoms are not impinged on as such. But I do hope that we will be educated, and some of the misinformation that is out there will be debunked, and that we can all come to a collective conclusion that maybe nothing nefarious, maybe as we thought, that is going on here is actually taking place. And I hope that's the trajectory we take in allowing people's freedom to take or not to take the vaccine to remain as it is, and that we won't get to a place where law is used to enforce this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Webley?
I agree with Dr. Wilson completely. My initial thought was, I hope not. I hope that we do not get to the place where some law is enacted and enforced that people need to get the vaccine. A vaccine is a medication, it's a medicine. And you should not force a medicine upon any person. They should be able to conscientiously object to taking something that they don't yet fully understand or want to take. However, with that freedom to make this type of decision that you're not going to get the vaccine for whatever reason, comes consequences and responsibilities, which is true of any freedom. So it is possible, as Dr. Wilson said, that some employer could say to you, I want you to be vaccinated or you can't work here. And that could be in the healthcare industry, or it could be in public service, somebody who is driving a public bus, or a part of a taxi fleet, or somebody who is in a school setting. And they might say, as they do now in many countries, if your child is not vaccinated, or if you're not vaccinated, you can't come here. I mean, of course, the coronavirus vaccine hasn't been offered to children because it hasn't been tested in them. So at the same time that we're hoping that those who are elected, those who we put in power to help us to have good lives from day to day, that they won't go back to the place where they enforce this type of COVID passport and restrict our choices in making health decisions.
Yes, and certainly there's an economic pressure that is building. You can hear this, you can sense this. Dr. William?
Yes, I agree with what the previous panelists have said, but I think if we think about it, we're in Holocaust Memorial Week, so it kind of reminds us of what happens where state uses political pressure to persecute religious minorities and the dangers of that. But they're very real, tangible situations, isn't it? It's not based on a sort of a conspiracy theory. We saw that very real. See what's happening in China with Uyghur Muslims, where they've been rounded up, put into camps on the basis of their religious faith, which then begs us a question that if we are people of faith, we also have to be people of faith and justice, justice for all, where we stand up for the liberties and the rights and freedoms of all, and not allow any group to face unjust persecution on the basis of their minority status. And in a way that we should learn, I think, from these ideas of mark of the beast or oppressive practices, is that if we fear these things, then we should be champions of religious, social, and political liberty and of fairness and justice.
Yes. Thank you. And I'm just moving around the table. So the question really is, in this socio-political arena, we have to consider the expression, no one is safe until everyone is safe. So there's a pressure from the economic perspective, but there's also a pressure from the medical perspective, because look, everyone needs to be safe. So how do we balance this, Dr. Amanda, Bishop Rowe?
With this question, one of the things I was thinking about is something that I've observed actually, which is where some employees in the NHS have agreed to take the vaccine and some haven't. And just again, I know I seem to have focused a lot on the divide and the divisive element of the COVID vaccine. And something, again, I've seen even in these departments is, again, a divide, because there is something about, okay, well, if this is something that's going to help us and going to be progressive, if we all take this vaccine, then actually to know that some colleagues agree to take it and then some others perhaps working in the same department refuse to. You know, there is almost these feelings of resentment and division that are building up even among colleagues, you know, and I think that's quite an interesting and quite a difficult situation to navigate, because then even in and amongst the team now, it's, you know, are we working together to cure, you know, and to move beyond this, or actually or is it seen that there are some people that are actually holding us back because they're refusing to? And then in itself, does that then lead to almost a guilt for those who perhaps aren't so comfortable or aren't willing to take it? You know, and just what's happening among teams psychologically and in terms of division. And also, again, just to the point that I made earlier about, you know, our responsibility in taking, you know, the question was asked, you know, if we feel it's going to be compulsory, if we're going to have to, and personally, I would hope not. But then at the same time, I also think about what that will do to people in terms of what I said earlier about the idea of trauma that comes out of feeling as though we've lost the ability to make our own decisions, you know, and what happens when someone feels forced into doing something and feels as though they haven't had their own free will. What happens is we believe we have no control. And oftentimes, you know, working with people, a lot of the personality disorders, mental health presentations, many of them are because people have found themselves in situations where control had been taken away from them, which has then led on to, you know, things such as PTSD, you know, borderline personality disorders or EUPD. Various other things have come out of the feeling of a loss of control, which could potentially be something that we're seeing psychologically if people felt forced into having to take a vaccine.
No, thank you for that, Dr. Amanda. We actually have another question for you. As we know, within the mental health, you know, industry, Black people can feel dubious or skeptical of it, particularly with sectioning and such things. How would you encourage those, particularly those who are in lockdown, might have lost jobs due to this COVID-19 pandemic, to access services, and also from an economical point of view? Oftentimes, accessing counselling can come at a cost that not everybody in society can afford. Could you give some tips for people that might be suffering with mental health due to this pandemic to access help?
Okay, yeah, I think the first thing is it is so important to know that you don't have to cope alone. It's so important to feel able to reach out and talk to somebody. yes, counselling, if you go for private counselling, then yes, it does tend to come at a higher cost. Some people will offer a sliding scale. There are actually a lot of services that are offering free or low cost counselling. It might take a bit of research into what's available in your area. But I know, especially actually with COVID, one of the things that's happened is there have been lots of people that have actually come forward and said, you know what, they will offer periods of, even if it's say maybe short-term counselling support for people, and actually also within the Black community. So it is about sort of doing a little bit of research into seeing what's available locally. Also, you know, it's important as well to go to your church and see what's happening within your church. I know church leaders are definitely talking about, you know, how to support their congregation. And I think, you know, perhaps speaking with your pastor, seeing what additional support they may give you. Maybe you need to be able to speak to someone, to have somebody to pray with you, to offer that good counsel as well. And that may be something you may be able to get free without maybe having to wait for a waiting list if you were to go into a service. That might be easier accessible through the support that the church might be able to offer. And certainly also to go to your GP as well, you know, and to speak to your GP, because they will have information on all the services that are local as well. They may be able to make a referral on your behalf, or at least direct you in where to go. We certainly know as well that there are lots of online services now. You know, not only I think have we advanced in terms of, you know, most of our meetings at work and various things are now online. Actually, a lot of services are offering, you know, online counselling services or online community groups as well. And sometimes the community groups can be quite a nice place to go. I mean, it's important to check them out because not all of them will be, you know, most helpful, and not all of them are well vetted. But there are lots that are well vetted, and where you can be among a community where they may be talking on certain points and encouraging each other, highlighting other agencies that you may be able to go to. And those are really quite useful so that people don't feel so alone. You know, and also I'd encourage people to talk to those around them, talk to friends, you know, talk to family. Don't be afraid to share how you are feeling, because, you know, I think oftentimes we feel isolated in how we feel. But actually, you know, it is a shared feeling at the moment. And, you know, by speaking, by reaching out to somebody and just saying, you know what, this is how I'm feeling about what's happening, you might be actually surprised to know that others are sharing that same feeling, others are going through the same thing. And I think as well, in addition to talking as well, sometimes it's important to know where there might be a need for a bit more support, you know, rather than not just to rely on maybe talking. But if, you know, maybe we're finding ourselves feeling quite psychologically unwell, you know, then actually is something more happening. I know earlier Bishop Leonard said that, you know, he was talking about sleep deprivation, and we know that sleep has been massively impacted by the lockdown. You know, do we need to look further into maybe our sleeping patterns and our eating patterns? You know, we know that we can't socialize with people presently, but maybe we're not actually interacting with anybody even behind the scenes. Maybe we're not even having those virtual interactions, and maybe there's a bit more space for us to engage more with people in those ways. You know, also, how are we looking after our physical health? Because something as well that's important is routine. Because for many of us, we have lost routine, you know, where we haven't had to get up at a certain time and get the certain bus or train, you know, and pick up the kids at a certain time. So what happens is that we lose that structure. And in losing that structure, sometimes that just messes up everything, because then we find ourselves reaching the end of the day and having not achieved the very things that we know we may needed to have set out. And now all of a sudden we've got this backlog of things that we need to do. Maybe we're not even looking after ourselves physically. You know, we know that this COVID's helped some of us, we put on weight. You know, for some of us as well, we know that there have been, you know, just the impact of not having a job, you know, and how that has impacted us. It's impacted us financially, and also as well how we may feel about our status. You know, also how's that impacted maybe on our rent and on various other things. And it might be important that we go to the council or citizens' advice as well, to just seek advice on what support might be out there, because it might be that there are certain benefits you might be entitled to, but because we've never relied on benefits before, we don't know where to go and to look for the support and the help. So instead we feel that we're trying to struggle. And sometimes it might just be a case of ringing up the gas company, ringing up certain companies and saying, look, this is what's happened. And, you know, can I have a payment plan in place, or can I have certain things stopped? Or can we, you know, I think it's important that we feel able to talk about whatever the circumstances are that we are faced, rather than feeling like somehow I've got to find my own way through this and struggle alone. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, can I just add a little bit to that? Thank you so much, Dr. Amanda, for that. I just want to say, within my own the work that I do within Church of God of Prophecy, we do offer a counseling service, Sentient Counseling Service, and I'm sitting here to represent Sentient. And you can access us quite easily. If you go to the cogop.org.uk website, you will find us there. And this is voluntary. There are no charges whatsoever. And sometimes all one needs is just someone to talk to. And we're prepared, we listen, we hear, and we care. And I would love you to use us. If at all we can assist, please, cogop.org.uk. We will be waiting for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so very much. I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone. This has been rich, really rich, in depth. We don't find pearls on the beach. We have to dive deep to find them. And indeed, we have dived much deeper. And the responses that we are getting this evening are really very positive. Still, there are many questions. And so, on behalf of Shamara and I wish to express our profound gratitude to every panelist this evening. Dr. Webley, it's really very good to have met you, and certainly in going forward, we would love to invite you again to step across the pond. The Atlantic is very small, really. And Dr. Wilson, likewise, you're very close, and we continue to engage with you. Dr. William Acker, thank you so much for that reflection and ongoing participation. Dr. Amanda, so many wonderful nuggets, precious suggestions that we could engage with. And it's been a joy working with Shamara this evening. But we're going to ask Bishop Rowe, who we wish to thank also, because clearly our panelists have to leave, to pray a pastoral prayer. We began with him in mind, and we're going to close out with a pastoral prayer by Bishop Rowe. Thank you, Bishop Rowe.
Thank you. Just bow your heads with me. I think that we have talked about some wonderful things this evening. We have looked at the efficacy of the vaccine, and we are grateful for all our medical men and researchers and everybody else who are involved in looking after our welfare. But we know that in all things and for all sickness, the efficacious blood of Jesus Christ meets absolutely every need. So let me pray. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Father, we have come to the end of this evening's meeting, and we thank you for being with us throughout. Thank you for speakers Dr. Amanda Brown-Bennett, Professor Wilmore Webley, Dr. William Acker, Dr. Garrick Wilson, and Mayor Andy Street. And thank you too for co-hosts Bishop Tedroy Powell and Shamara Fletcher, and for all those who joined from near and far. May your abiding presence and grace be with them and their families. Father, the purpose of our meetings or of our meeting was to communicate the work taking place. It was to support church members and wider constituents from our African and Caribbean communities in making informed choices about the COVID-19 vaccine. It was to give accurate and timely information which will help to address the genuine concerns many have regarding the vaccine. It was to engage with credible and reliable information from a theological and faith-based perspective. and it was to ask questions and to get answers to troubling concerns. Lord, we believe that we have successfully met these objectives. And so we ask that you will grant us godly wisdom to apply what we have learned in order to make the right decisions for ours, our family, and our wider community's good. Lord, we are now to pray for our medical workers across the world, for doctors and nurses, consultant surgeons and specialized staff, for paramedics who provide emergency medical care to those en route to hospitals, for porters, cooks, cleaners, and building managers, and for everyone involved in our national health service. Lord, we likewise pray for our scientists and researchers, for data analysts, and all those who are working behind the scenes to do good for the benefit of nations and people. And Father, we remember too those who are sick and in hospitals, those isolating at home and elsewhere, for those with underlying health issues, for the bereaved, the lonely, and the anxious, for our children who cannot go to school, for parents and guardians everywhere. And we pray too for governments who bear considerable responsibilities and make decisions which affect the lives of so many, not merely here in the United Kingdom, but worldwide. May you strengthen them and help them to act with honesty, transparency, and uncompromising adherence to principles and values which are right and good for nations and peoples of our world. And finally, Father, as we now depart from each other's presence, may your peace, which transcends understanding, and your living hope, which comes through your Son, even our Savior Jesus Christ, be with us now and always, from this time on, and even forevermore. Amen.
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 Thank you all again. Shamara, a final words, thoughts?
Yes, we want to thank all our amazing panel of experts this evening for your time, for sharing such credible information and advice. We also want to thank you for tuning in. You know, this is a very controversial topic. We won't all agree on everything, but it's so good to come together as a community and even to disagree well. So we look forward to connecting with you in our next series, and thank you for tuning in. Over to you, Bishop.
Thank you. Thank you again, panelists. We cannot say that enough. And so Illuminate will be online again next week, Sunday, at the earlier time of 6:30, while we continue this dialogue, this discussion, providing credible, reliable information to help our constituencies decide, because you're at the forefront, you're engaging. And we're also exposed to so many other challenges. So God bless you and thank you. Good night, everyone.
The Lord is my shepherd, goes before me, he goes before me, defender behind me, defender behind me, I will not fear, I won't fear, I'm filled with the anointing, I'm filled with anointing, my cup's overflowing, my cup's overflowing, No weapon can harm me. No weapon can harm me. I will not fear. I won't fear. We sing hallelujah. I am not alone. I am not alone. Yeah. 'Cause he's my comfort. Yeah. Holds me close. He always guides me. He always guides me through mountains and valleys. Who can testify that his joy is refreshing? Yeah, and it restores my soul. Oh yeah, sing mercy and goodness. Gives me assurance. That I'll see his glory. Glory, glory, face to face. Yeah. People sing hallelujah. I am not alone. victory. You're always fighting for me, yeah. You're my victory, Jesus. Sing my victory, 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 my victory,